hear just one voice.
Fine. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, okay. How are you, Julie?
I'm good.
Good. It's nice to see some people again. Okay, so let's start. Last week, remember we were talking about, well, I wanted to discuss the time of dreaming. That was the question. I was trying to answer the question, when do we dream? This week, I want to do something a little bit different, partly because it's planned in advance, and I always lock myself into a prison of the languages that other people say, which is the language of Lacan in a particular essay. So I regret the fact that I plan in advance because it kind of locks me into four walls, and it's not my typical approach, but this is the university, right? So if we were asking last week a question concerning the time of the dream or the time of dreaming, then this week I want to ask a question concerning, I guess, the stuff of the dream, the stuff of the dream. I mean, I don't mean stuff in terms of the dream thoughts, not in terms of latent and manifest content, which is what we were kind of talking about last week, although we will develop that a little bit more. Really what I'm trying to ask is, and I'm picking up from what a student last week was asking, what makes us dream? Other than this class, which could be a little exhausting, or any other class. The question is about the impetus of the dream, the engine of the dream, if you like. And I hope you remember we ended the last class with a quote. I have it in front of me because I'm using it to kind of guide me today. It was a quote that I took from a footnote in Freud's text, The Interpretation of Dreams. It's a revealing quote. I think it's a woke quote in a sense, because it was concerning something singular about the dream, about something about the dreamer, him or herself. I'm going to share it with you on the screen. Here it is. Forgive me for taking over the screen so aggressively, but here we go. So here's the quote. It's a long one. It's from a footnote. I think it's chapter 7, if my memory is correct. And this is Freud. He said, "I found it extraordinarily difficult to accustom my readers to the distinction between the manifest dream content and the latent dream thoughts." This is what we should know something about this week because of last week. Over and over again, the necessity of interpreting the dream was ignored. But now, when the analysts have at least become reconciled to substituting the manifest dream with its meaning, the latent content, as found by interpretation, many of them are guilty of another mistake to which they adhere just as stubbornly. So he's saying it's not just about interpreting the latent content, the meaning that's hidden in the dream. Let's continue. They look for the essence of the dream in this latent content, and thereby overlook the distinction between latent dream thoughts and dream work. So you see, he's adding another layer here. And this is the most important part from the quote. The dream is fundamentally nothing more than a special form of our thinking, a special form of our thinking, which is made possible by the conditions of the sleeping state. As we know, that was Freud's supposition that we dream only when we're sleeping, in a sense. It's in the dream work which produces this form, and it alone is the essence of dreaming, the only explanation of its singularity, end quote. So he's saying the only explanation of what of the singularity of the dream, the essence of the dream, is not in the latent content, but in the dream work. So we've been focusing on this distinction then between the latent and manifest aspects of the dream, right? But here Freud in a footnote is claiming that there's another much more important distinction between, on the one hand, the latent and manifest content, and on the other hand, the dream work. So this dream work, he says in the quote, you can see, produces this form, which means that it's the engine. It's the impetus of the dream thoughts, what is singular for the dreamer. So let's plot it a little bit. I promise I won't draw too many diagrams today. That's my promise to you. So we have manifest content, we know. We should know something about this. We have latent content. We should know something about this from last class, right? And we know that the way in psychoanalysis through full speech, through full speech aims to bring us from the manifest content to the latent content. This is something we know from last class. And we also now know that we hope to go from, let's say, the latent content, or from all of this, to, what did he call it again? The dream work? Why is it not typing? The dream work. And that ultimately is the goal of interpretation, of psychoanalytic interpretation. The ultimate goal is to go all the way down to the dream work and not to just reveal the meaning that's embedded in the dreams through the latent content. So he's saying interpretation aims at what's singular of dreaming about each one of us. It doesn't just aim at deciphering dreams. It's very important. Okay. Let's stop this. So through the patient's full speech, we get a sense of the latent content, but interpretation in this conception from Freud is about going further than that, touching something of the singularity of the dream work itself. Sorry, is there a chat? Somebody's telling, is this me? Oh, sorry, it's a private message. Apologies. Okay. I'm officially that old man who doesn't know technology. Okay, so that's why the arrows are moving in that direction. So we can imagine arrows also moving in the other direction, going from the dream work up to produce the latent content, if you like, to show that the dream work is the impetus or the engine of the dream, and it gives way or gives birth to the latent and manifest content. Right? So the point is interpretation aims at the singularity of the dream, and not necessarily or not exclusively or not only the deciphering of the dream, undistorting it. That's the most important point I'm trying to make. So let's explore that a little bit further. Let's explore a bit further the question, what makes us dream? And it's a question I don't think can be answered so easily with the text that I've actually selected for this week. Again, the problem of planning in advance. It's an early text from Lacan, I think from the early 1950s. I might be wrong, but I think it's around that time. And it's titled The Seminar on the Purloined Letter. It's a very, very difficult text, okay? Everything from Lacan seems very, very difficult. I really just want you to get a sense of Lacan's writing style when you look at it. And maybe one or two important themes from this particular period of Lacan's teaching, because this period does change. This is a period when he was interested, just to give you a preface, in the concept of death drive. This is before he abandoned the concept of death drive and exchanged it for the concept of jouissance. So let's say that in my understanding, this is psychoanalysis then, and jouissance is psychoanalysis of the future. So let's begin with something simple. Lacan claimed that the unconscious is structured like a language. It's so important, I'm going to write it on the screen. This is an exact quote. The unconscious is structured like a language. Okay, what does it mean? The unconscious is structured like a language. Well, first, he didn't claim that the unconscious was itself a language. This is extremely important, and I have to really emphasize it because we speak Russian in Russia for the most part, and English is usually a second language. And so to emphasize this point seems particularly important, and I'll tell you why. We have an indefinite article in the English and French languages. Lacan was speaking French. They have indefinite articles in French and English. An indefinite article you don't have in the Russian language. So I said a language. I didn't say the language, right? I didn't say the unconscious was itself the language. I said the unconscious, or Lacan said the unconscious is structured like a language, which doesn't mean that it's structured like Russian language, or like an English language, or like a French language, or like any other particular language. He's not claiming that the unconscious is structured like one particular language, a language like Russian. Not everybody in the world has a Russian unconscious or an English unconscious, for example. He's also not claiming that it's the language. The unconscious is structured like the language, as if there's one universal language that we all share and we can all communicate with one another and we all understand each other. So he's not saying the unconscious is structured like the language. He said the unconscious is structured like a language, So we can't claim that the unconscious is English. We can't claim that it's Russian. We can't claim that the unconscious is French. But that's not to say that because you were raised Russian, where you don't have definite articles or indefinite articles, or the, in front of let's say a noun, that has an effect upon the way you live your life and the way you think about the world. And it certainly has an effect upon your unconscious. It has effects in the world of love and how you love people, if you don't use definite articles in the way that they do in French and English, or if you do use them. It's a different, it can make you relate to the world in different ways. For example, how can the man be the one for you universally in an abstract sense if he's not here in front of you in the Russian language? You can't distinguish him from a man. So he can't be the man. It's a big philosophical question. How can the woman be the woman for you? The only woman in an abstract sense, even when she's missing, when she's not there, if you don't know that she could likewise be a woman, a particular woman among many other women in a series. The point is the unconscious is structured like a language, but not a particular language. It's structured like a language. It's interesting to me because I'm using the phrase like a language. I don't know if you know this, but when I say like a language, I'm using a linguistic trope known as a simile. Do you know what a simile is? If you do, could you just sort of put your thumbs up? No? Okay. You know what metaphor is, right? Right. Okay. Well, simile is taught to English speakers usually in elementary school, and you learn about metaphor usually a little bit because simile is easy to understand. There's no difficulty with what a simile is. A simile is different from a metaphor. Okay. A simile makes a comparison between two things, but it makes that comparison very obvious because you're using the word like or the word as. So this mouse is like a mouse. It resembles a mouse. It's similar to a mouse. So we could say, if we wanted to use a simile, that you are like a nightmare to me. You could say you are like a nightmare. It's a simile. A metaphor, on the other hand, doesn't make the comparison explicit. You know, a metaphor will say, you are this nightmare of my life. You see, the metaphor actually brings two things together into one. That's the role of a metaphor. Perhaps an individual like a man and the nightmare are made one object. Man is a nightmare. The man is essentially a nightmare. That's what he is, you could say. That's a metaphor. It's a novelty. It produces a new meaning. Now man means nightmare. It's creative. Metaphor is creative. That's why the poets use metaphor. It introduces new meaning out of two old meanings. It's a type of condensation, what Freud called condensation. You remember from last week, you take two things and you press them together. That's the point. A simile doesn't work like that. It retains the distinction. If I say a man is like a nightmare, I'm still a man, there's still a nightmare out there, and they're not necessarily the same thing, but they're similar. Simile sounds like similar. So that's a simile. I said the unconscious is structured like a language. That's what Lacan said too. So he didn't say the unconscious is a structured language. That would mean you could say it's Russian. That would mean you could say it's English. He said it's structured like a language. So he didn't use a metaphor. And I think that's really important. It's structured like a language, which means that he used a simile, not a metaphor, but a simile. You can see how these two objects of the sentence, the unconscious and language, are actually still distinct things, but that they're related to one another in some way. The unconscious is, as a simile, somewhat autonomous from language. It's not completely language. There's some relative autonomy between the unconscious and language. Or to put it a different way, you could say there's something of the unconscious that cannot be reduced to the processes of condensation. The latent content, for example. That's my point. And I hope some of you are starting to get a little sense of why this might be important. Maybe you don't yet, but it's leading me to a claim, and hopefully to a claim about why jouissance is so important by the end of the course. Let's see. The unconscious is structured like a language. One way that scholars have approached this claim, the unconscious is structured like a language, it's not my way of approaching it, but it's a way that's popular among scholars of psychoanalysis, it is to claim that, why don't I stop sharing this whiteboard? It's dominating my screen. Okay, one way to understand this claim, the unconscious is structured like a language, is to claim that, well, the scientific study of language maybe can give us a gateway into understanding the unconscious, which is, I would say, the most important concept in psychoanalysis. So a lot of people turn to the scientific study of language. This is why many psychoanalysts turn to studying, I'm writing it in the chat, semiotics. Some people also call it semiology. Semiotics or semiology, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call it semiotics. Semiotics is the scientific study of language. And a lot of psychoanalysts have turned to semiotics. One thinker, namely Ferdinand de Saussure, S-A-U-S-S-U-R-E, he, in his approach to the scientific study of language, to semiotics, he began with what he called the smallest meaningful unit of language. Now, he's not a psychoanalyst, he's just a linguist. He's a linguist, and he's just studying language scientifically. He's not interested in the unconscious. But we're interested in Saussure. So Saussure said, well, let's begin, when we do our scientific study of language, let's begin with the smallest meaningful unit of language, which is what he called a sign, S-I-G-N. A sign for Saussure is the smallest meaningful unit of language. So we can't say ka or ha. I think that's an X in Russian. I might be wrong. Ha, or whatever it is. You can't say that's a sign, that first sound, ka or da or whatever. That's not, because it's not meaningful. It's just a sound. That's a phoneme. It's not a sign because it's just a sound without meaning. It's a minimal sound, ka. A sign is the smallest meaningful unit of language. So we could say that language has a surplus of signs. And our goal, according to Saussure, as a linguist, is to study signs. So how do we study a sign scientifically? How do you study a sign scientifically? You study a sign scientifically by claiming that it's always composed of two aspects known as the signifier and the signified. If somebody wants to write those words in chat, in case you're not sure how to spell them, that would be doing me a favor. Signifier and signified. A sign is, by definition, for Saussure, the unity of a signifier and a signified. Thank you so much. Thank you. So a sign is always the unity of a signifier and a signified, and taken together, that's the minimal meaningful unit of language that we should study in the scientifical, oh, my word plays off today, study of language. So we have a new question then. It's a deferred question. What is a signifier? What's a signified? Right? Let's begin with the signifier. For Saussure, a signifier is an index or a locus or a pointer of a concept or idea that's located elsewhere. A signifier, the easiest way is to just think of it as a finger that's pointing at something. The signifier is pointing at a meaning, or sorry, a concept or an idea that's elsewhere. It doesn't itself have it. It's just a pointer. Anybody who does computer programming maybe knows what a pointer is. It's when you have a variable in the computer code that doesn't itself retain the array, that doesn't itself retain the information. It points at a memory address of another spot. So a pointer just points at something else. The signifier then is a trigger. Signifier is a trigger. It triggers the concept or idea in the mind of a person. So a signifier is what Saussure called a sound image. That's what Saussure called it. It's a sound image. It's an obscure notion because you have sound and sight. Sound and image are two different things, it would seem, but we won't get into that. For simplicity's sake, just imagine that the signifier is the sound you make with your mouth, but also the unique way in which you position your tongue and your teeth and so on as you're making the sound. So for perhaps you place the tongue on the top of the roof of your mouth and you go duh, Wayne, duh, duh. That's the unique sound. Duh and Wayne. The way I've moved my mouth is a signifier. I've produced a sound. Forget about what Dwayne means. It's empty of meaning. Trust me. The arbitrariness implies. Sorry, I should claim that the sign is arbitrary. But let me explain what I mean by that. Saussure had a two-body theory of communication. I think I'll open up a whiteboard again. I wanted to go through this quickly, but now I'm starting to think I won't be able to. So Saussure had a two-body theory of communication, which means that, okay, there's two bodies. My body drawings, ooh, that must be me because he's got a giant forehead. Okay, so you got these two people. Hi, I'm a people. Hi, I'm a people. You people, bro. Okay, so they're people, and they're talking to each other, which means something's coming out of this person's mouth into the ear of that person, and something's coming out of this person's mouth into the ear of that person. It's a two-body theory, which means that it presumes that there's something intersubjective. It presumes that one person says something, the other person listens, the other person says something and returns, and you listen, and so on. It's a two-body theory of communication in that sense. One of them's producing a sign, or we might say a few signs, but let's keep it simple and say it's one sign. The other person hears the sign, produces a sign, and sends it back. It's sign language. They're talking to each other using signs. Okay, so maybe somebody says cat. So the person on the left says cat. So we have a signifier. SF means signifier, and the signifier is at, the sounds you make when you say cat. Okay, and now I'm going to try and make this as simple as possible. It's not as precise as it should be, but the signifier is just the sound that indexes a concept or an idea that you have of a cat. So if the sign includes the signifier and the signified, then what is the signified for at? Well, it's the idea I have of a cat, and this is my idea of a cat. Okay. I have a sort of idea of a cat. That's what a cat looks like in my head. Okay. The sign includes the signifier, which is the sound at, and it points at the signified, which is this idea that I have of a cat in my head. Okay, so the signified is just the concept or their idea that's pointed at by the signifier. So when one person says cat, it brings to mind the concept or idea of a cat for him. The problem is that he or she is saying this to another person. Okay, I'm not calling the sign a pronoun because this is where the arbitrariness comes in. And maybe the other person hears the signifier, at, right? But it calls to mind a different idea of a cat. Maybe it's a tiger with big teeth. These are ears. I can't draw. This is, you know, me. Okay. But it's a different cat, which is the point. We don't have the same idea of what a cat is, just as some people don't have the same idea of what particular genders are and so on, right? This is even a subject of big debate, you probably know. So the idea is that the cat can be a different concept or idea in another person's mind. We're able to claim for this reason, and this is precisely what Saussure said, that the sign system is arbitrary. It's arbitrary. The signifier is arbitrary in its relationship to the sign. There's no inherent reason why my idea of a cat should be anchored to this particular index cat. For example, when I say waterfall, some of you might, here, I'll give you a better example. This is a really good one. In my class one time, I played a game called the Beetle in the Box game. That's what I'm calling it. I stole it from Wittgenstein. I turned it into a game. What I did was I took a whole bunch of sheets of paper and I drew beetles on the bottom of every one, and I put them face down and distributed them to the class, okay? I said, take a peek at what you have on the opposite side of your sheet of paper, put it down, don't say anything. Okay? And then I said, if you have a beetle, if your signified is a beetle, signifier is what the sound I'm making, beetle. If you have a beetle on the bottom of your sheet of paper, just raise your hand. Everybody raised their hands. That's how language works. You know, it's public in this way. We all think we're talking about the same thing when we're talking, don't we? And we believe we have this consensus, and we could have kept going on with the class. And this is actually how a class functions. You keep going on despite the fact that everybody's confused about everything. So you lift the sheet of paper up, and what you realize actually is one person has a drawing of the insect, another person has a drawing of the Volkswagen Beetle, the car, another person has a drawing of Ringo Starr, one of the members of the Beatles, the band, another person has the word Beetle written in cursive and so on. You know, this is the point. It's arbitrary. There's no inherent reason why the signifier should point at the signified that we say it points at. But Saussure said it does take on a certain naturalness, a certain unshakability, a certain conviction of the signifier tied to the signified. There's nothing natural, though, about the sign. But we have to take it as though it's natural. You can't just invent your own word, for example. Karabara. You don't know what the hell I'm talking about. There's no signified there for you. There is for me. It means pen, okay? It's language is very conservative according to Saussure. It takes a long time for it to evolve, less time than it used to today, and we can talk about why, but this is his idea. Language is conservative. It doesn't, you can't evolve new signifieds, new words, new signs very easily. We could debate this, and there's a good reason why we can debate it today, but let's just stick to what Saussure is saying. It's not easy to change the pairing of a signifier and a signified. So the final thing I just wanted to say about this part, about the sign equals signifier and signified, is that there's no referent here. If somebody wants to type the word referent into chat, that would be great so other people can see which word I'm saying. Referent is the actual thing in the real world. Das Ding, the real thing. The real thing, the real concrete object in the world. Saussure said, we're linguists. We're not interested in real things in the world. So we're not interested in the cat that'll scratch you and bite you and stick its tail up and walk away and expect you to chase it and will chase the mouse and so on. We're not interested in that type of cat. That's the real cat. We're interested in the idea of a cat we have in our mind as linguists. It's the same in some sense with psychoanalysis. So we bracket out the referent. We don't talk about real things in the world in this way. Thanks, Maria. So we're interested in the mental impression, in a sense. Okay, so man, I'm taking much more time than I wanted to. The point, well, I guess there's one more point I should make about Saussure. It concerns this concept of what he calls value. This was taken up, this idea, much later by post-structuralist thinkers, namely Jacques Derrida and some others, Judith Butler and so on, if you've heard of them. Value for Saussure concerns the place of a sign or a signifier within a network of signifiers or signs. So, language is like a network of words, to put it simply. It's a differential system of signifiers. There's a network, there's a battery, there's a group of signifiers. Perhaps you have the signifier bat, B-A-T, a bat. I think of, the bat from like the Batman. A bat is a bat. It has value as a let's call it a signifier or a sign, because it's not a rat. It doesn't sound like rat, therefore it has value within the system as bat. Its meaning is more precise because of what it is not. That's the point. A given signifier obtains its value, which is its value is always a question of its precision, how precisely it can define or point at something. Because there are other signifiers in the network. I'm going to give you a concrete example, don't worry. It means that if you add more signifiers, more words to a language, keep it simple. You add more words to a language, it increases the precision of all other words in the language. It's fascinating, but it's simple once you kind of wrap your head around it. I'll give you an example. In the northern part of Canada, I think some of you already know this, there's an anthropologist named Boas who studied it, I think. There's an indigenous group where they have like more than 40 words for snow. You know this? I think I mentioned it before. They have like more than 40 words for snow. And when you have more than 40 words for snow, it increases the precision of the reality that you can imagine. You can talk about wet snow, hard snow. They have a word for snow that you can form into a ball. They have all these different words for snow. When you only have one or two words for snow, it's harder to speak of the reality you want to, in a sense. I'm told in the Arabic language, they have like a dozen or so words for love. You can imagine what that means for the world of love. You can be much more precise about the type of love that you have for another person. So that's Saussure's work in a nutshell. What does it have to do with Lacan? What does it have to do with psychoanalysis? Well, let's return to the thread. Lacan claimed that the unconscious is structured like a language. Well, what we notice with Freud's work is that the dream work, what he called the dream work, comes through as if it were a picture puzzle, he said, a rebus, a picture puzzle that needs to be deciphered. That's Freud's claim. How would we read it? It means that it needs to be interpreted as if it were a language. The dream is like a language to be deciphered in the early then days of psychoanalysis, let's say. So let's begin with a fundamental insight made by Lacan in his essay, the Purloined Seminar on the Purloined Letter. I'm not going to talk about everything in this essay because it's big and it's complicated. I'm just going to take a few pieces. First, Lacan writes, and I'm going to quote on whiteboard for you. Actually, no, I'll put it in chat. It'll be easier for me. This is the quote that I'm taking. Lacan writes, "It is the symbolic order which is constitutive for the subject." Subject means what is most unique to each one of us, okay? "It is the symbolic order which is constitutive for the subject. The major determination the subject receives from the itinerary of a signifier," end quote. Okay, let's try and understand this. It has a few important parts. First, I would say it's got three words that are really important: symbolic order, subject, and signifier. We have three major concepts: symbolic order, subject, and signifier in this quote. "It is the symbolic order which is constitutive for the subject. The major determination the subject receives is from the itinerary of a signifier." So you see, he's basically saying the signifier is related to the symbolic order. It's the stuff of the symbolic order. Well, because the symbolic order constitutes, makes, fabricates, produces, gives birth to the subject, each one of us. We are formed by language, by signifiers, and in the then conception of psychoanalysis, in Freudian, early Lacanian thought. So the subject is, each one of us, according to this quote, determined by the itinerary the traveling, the plans of the signifier. Plan as you might, the signifier has already planned you. So let's try and understand it a little bit more. We need to recognize that Lacan fundamentally changed Saussure's understanding of language, his conception of language. For Lacan, the sign, signifier, and signified are no longer bundled into this unitary package called the sign. Remember, for Saussure, a sign is the unity of a signifier and a signified. For Lacan, that's not true. Saussure begins with the sign. Lacan prioritized the signifier. The signifier is at the beginning for the subject. There's no subject without the signifier for early Lacan. For Saussure, we see in his conception, there's basically no subject. There is no subject for Saussure. That's scientifically proven in his work. There's no subject in his study of language. He never uses the word subject. And I think there's a very important reason. It's because it's science. So how might we think about this? Maybe I'm going to open whiteboard again. What a crazy drawing, my God. Okay, so I'm thinking, let's say we have Saussure, and let's say we have Lacan. They're not a very good group with one another, but they are there. For Saussure, he begins with the sign. And then he goes on, of course, to discuss the signifier and the signified, which I write like this, okay? Signifier and signified. It's just shorthand. So in a sense, he's beginning with the sign. That's, let's say, prioritizing one. And then secondly, he's got the signifier and the signified as bundled into the concept of the sign. Well, with Lacan at the beginning, what you have is a signifier. Let's call it S1, signifier 1. And then over here, you have something like, I don't know, I'm just going to put the signified for now in square brackets because it's not entirely true. I need to still develop this. But the point is, you begin with S1, with one signifier at the beginning with Lacan. With Saussure, you don't. So Saussure, no scientific interest in the subject. What makes each one of us unique? He's studying language scientifically. It's scientific in that way because there's no science in his algebra, no subject in his algebra. But for Lacan, the subject is determined by the symbolic order. That's what he said a moment ago. By the signifier, by signifier 1. Okay, what happens next? For Saussure, next, the signifier and signified are brought together into a unity that we call the sign. That's what happens next for Saussure. But for Lacan, the signifier stands outside of any unity. The sign, because the sign we know is a unity that it pre-exists the signifier in a sense. This is why we get from Lacan the following phrase, which I'm quoting. I'll put it into the whiteboard. He discusses, Lacan, the supremacy of the signifier over the signified. The supremacy. It comes straight out of his Écrits, which is the book from which the seminar on the purloined letter was extracted. So let's discuss for a moment Lacan's conception of the sign. It's different. He's interested in the signifier, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have a conception of the sign. Okay, what is a sign for Lacan? Well, in his first 2 seminars, and he's got many seminars, more than 20-something seminars, Lacan, in his first 2 seminars, discusses the sign as being distinguished from a world of signifiers. You know, for Saussure, the signifier is the unity of a the sign is the unity of a signifier and a signified. For Lacan, in some sense, in the early part of his teaching, which is what we're focusing on now, because that's psychoanalysis then, the sign is somewhat independent from an understanding of the signifier, somewhat. So the sign doesn't operate in an intersubjective way within speech, according to Lacan. So you can't have a two-body communication model with signs when you're talking about signs. There are not two bodies. A sign, he says, Lacan says, is at the level of an animal response. So a sign, unlike symbolic speech, for Lacan in the early part of his teaching, we're going to critique this in another class. The sign in the early part of Lacan's teaching, it cannot lie. There can be no mistakes when you're communicating through signs. There's no lies, there's no mistakes, there's no errors, there's no deceptions, or to be even more precise, but this is going to make you scratch your head, and I apologize, but if you want to be really precise, a sign cannot tell the truth in the form of a lie. And that's important. Only humans can tell the truth in the form of a lie. But this isn't something you need to know today. It's just a treat for those of you who want it. So it implies that the sign operates more within a domain of its certainty. It can be certain of something. Whereas speech, in a sense, because it's dominated by signifiers, operates more within a domain of doubt. Speech doubts itself, it lies, it has mistakes, it has slips of the tongue, it has errors, it has deceptions. Okay, next he claims, Lacan, that machines don't think because a machine only does what it's told to think. We can debate this, absolutely. I would debate it. But this was his early claim. It's a contentious claim. So we seem to have these three levels of the sign for Lacan. I'm writing in chat. First, there's the sign as biological, which means animal. Second, there's the sign as cybernetic, which is as machine. And third, there's the sign as language, which means human in a sense.
We can't see what you write in the chat. I guess you're writing.
Oh my God, I've been writing this to one person. Apologies. Okay, I'll rewrite it. Thank you for that. There we go. I'm also going to repost the quote that I posted earlier. Oh my God, the whole chat I've been writing to just one person. I'm sorry, everyone. It's a one-body form of communication. So Lacan seems to make this claim. I'm simplifying. Another way to put it maybe is like this. The sign is taken as an object. The sign is taken as a trace. And then the sign is taken as a signifier. This is his early conception. Let's try and understand it a bit more clearly because it really is important even if you don't see its immediate applicability. When a sign is biological, it's a form of communication that's attached to the body. It means a sign is, I don't know, maybe like it's not exactly true, but like a peacock feather. It's still attached to the body. The sign is an object that's still attached to what it's pointing at in a sense. That's number one. Number two, the sign is like a trace, which means that the object has gone missing. The object isn't there anymore. Something has gone missing, and what's missing has left an imprint. So Lacan says, imagine a footprint leaving an impression in the sand. The foot isn't there anymore, but the footprint is a trace of what object was there. The impression is still there. In this case, I'm quoting Lacan, the sign and the object separate. So if, when we're taking the sign as an object, the sign is the object, there's no separation, it's in the body in a sense. Then in the second case, sign as a trace, the object has gone missing. So the sign has separated from its object, like a footprint. There's an impression. The object isn't there anymore. It's a clear separation. There's a clear impression, and we have a trace of the object that was there. When you see footprints in the sand, it's a sign that somebody was there. The object was once there. So the impression is what remains. We call that a trace. In fact, I have a quote here. I've been just telling you in my own way, but why not share the quote? This is Lacan. The trace is precisely what the object leaves behind once it has gone off somewhere else. Okay, so first, the sign is connected to the object. Second, it's separated, leaving an impression. Third, finally, the object has gone missing, but attaches to another object that is also missing. This is the domain of human speech, according to early Lacan. It's the domain of the signifier. The signifier replaces the this is really tough stuff, I admit it, okay? The signifier replaces the object that has gone missing. The foot isn't there anymore, but it replaces that foot with another object that has gone missing, another signifier. I'm going to quote Lacan, put it in the chat, because I feel like I need to justify all of my points because they're so big. Let's read this. Quote, when have we passed over into the order of the signifier, the third order of the sign? The signifier is a sign that doesn't refer to any object, not even to one in the form of a trace, even though the trace nevertheless heralds the signifier's essential feature in the sense that it's missing. Oh, he says this. It too is the sign of an absence. But it goes further than just pointing at an object that's missing. But insofar as it forms part of language, human language, the signifier is a sign which refers to another sign, which as such is structured to signify the absence of another sign. Okay, so you're pointing at things that are missing everywhere. Language as such is endlessly pointing at things that don't exist. In other words, Saussure was right. We don't deal with the referent. Okay, so we have this conception of a sign. We have a conception of a signifier as a type of sign, or the sign as a type of signifier, I should say. In this early conception, he says that the signifier is a type of sign among other types of signs. So the signifier is a sign only in as much as it is a sign of something that has gone missing, pointing at another sign which has gone missing. So finally, to summarize all of this complexity in the most simplistic way possible, we just say that the signifier as such points at another signifier. That's it. So we have signifier 1 points at signifier 2. That's the whole point of it. That's human language. It's a system of signifiers only. It took all that development to say something so simple. We're not pointing at real things in the world, but we're also not pointing at signifieds. We're pointing at signifiers. So open whiteboard. Earlier when I wrote S1 pointing at something like a signified, it's actually we're pointing at, oh, I wrote SF. So yeah, signifier 1 pointing at signifier 2. It points at another signifier. It's precisely S2 as our signified. A signifier is actually what's taking place of the signified for Lacan. Okay, so what does all of this have to do with what the heck we're talking about? That's the question. Let's see if I can answer it. What does it have to do with dreams as picture puzzles that need to be deciphered as latent content, or with the unconscious structured like a language? Well, the early idea of Lacan was that the unconscious was a language to be deciphered. That was also the early idea of Freud. The dream contained meanings that were concealed behind these images. It was Freud's basic idea. The idea was that the manifest content is like a puzzle that needs to be deciphered. The speech of the patient as he or she or they spoke to the analyst about his or her dreams was never it. The manifest content was never it, because it concealed something of meaning that needed to be released from the latent content. So the preliminary task of analysis, of interpretation, was to reveal that latent content, to open up the dimension of full speech, to let those signifiers be free. So in a certain way, we could put it like this. We could say, it's not exactly accurate again, but it brings us closer. We could say we have, as we know, a dimension of full speech. Let's call this full speech. We can take that route, and we have a dimension of empty speech, manifest content, and we can take that route if we like. But they're opposite routes. They point at something different, sort of. You know, like imagine that it's a gate. There's a gate here where these two lines intersect. If you open the gate to go along the route of empty speech, then in some sense, you're closing the gate to full speech. It's like those train tracks, I guess, you know? Yet if you open the gate to full speech, what's interesting is you're closing, in some sense, the gate to empty speech. You're getting the real meaning there. But this isn't exactly how it functions either, but it's a nice intuitive model. Let's make it more precise, because I want to set everything up for what I finally want to say at the end of all this, at the end of my 4 classes. We need an account that takes account of the logic of the signifier. So let me draw it, and then I'll try and explain it. Sorry, just one moment. Okay, so let's just draw it first. My drawing isn't very nice looking. Hopefully you can sort of see what it should look like. Okay. Okay, so we have full speech. We have full speech, of course, is latent content. So we'll just put latent. Empty speech, of course, is manifest. Okay. If some of you recognize this diagram, it's probably for a good reason. It's in the lesson that it's in the seminar on the purloined letter, but this is a version of it. It's changed. In this version of the schema, you can see that all roads actually lead to the same place. Whether you take empty speech or full speech, you end up in the same place. Latent content, full speech, is already there within the empty speech, manifest content. That's what Freud said. So when you're speaking your blah, blah, blah about the dream, the meaning is already contained in there. It's just not released. So the problem is to dig it out. So you can take the scenic route to your destination. The scenic route is the dimension with beautiful imagery. Oh, I dreamed of colorful trees, of chirping birds or whatever. Or you can take the boat. The boat in this case is the path of full speech. Within full speech, you take passage across the turbulent the turbulent seas of your unconscious. Full speech traverses empty speech within the clinic. Okay, where is this symbolic order that Lacan was talking about earlier? It's the domain of the signifier. We know that. That's what he wrote in the quotation that I shared with you. It's the domain of signifier 1. It's the signifier whose itinerary we are determined as subjects to follow. It's the domain of signifier 1, which determines the subject. But we also have this other signifier, signifier 2. And I know this is really complicated, but it's complicated because it's true. Signifier 2, this is the domain where the signified should be, and indeed it often feels as though it's a signified, an idea that we have, a static idea or a static concept, but that's the image. The idea we have, it's the image. It's not what determines us. You know, we have images in our dreams, the beautiful trees, the birds chirping or whatever, but we're trying to get at the meaning behind it that's determining our desires, in a sense, and that's signifier 1. So if signifier 1 is within the domain of the symbolic order, which is this here, line going from top left to bottom right, then signified, or signifier 2, has to do with the imaginary, what Lacan calls the imaginary order, which is this axis, taking the scenic route. The scenic route still has a C that you have to traverse. You just don't do it directly. So the imaginary is like a picture puzzle, the rebus, as Freud calls it, the manifest content that comes through. Okay, so this is a preliminary way to think about signifiers in relation to psychoanalysis. You can see where signifier 1 is. It's what determines you as a subject. It's across the symbolic order. Signifier 2 is something that appears in the form of something signified, imaginary. But at the level of the symbolic, we know it's just another signifier. So what is the imaginary order? Remember, the scenic route is the space of the ideas, the dream ideas, the concepts of the dream. It's the speech concerning the mystery that needs to be solved. but hasn't yet been solved in analysis. So these are even the meanings that the patient professes in what he or she understood of his or her dream upon its first telling or second telling. It's the space of the signified. So if I were to plot it, I would say like signifier 1 is here, and signified is along this other pathway, somewhere along this other pathway here. Or you can call it SF2, whatever you want to call it. So what justifies our approach? Let's quote Lacan. Oh, can I open the chat in here? Yes, okay. Here's a quote from the Purloined Letter. And it says, as we know, it is in the experience inaugurated by psychoanalysis that we can grasp by what oblique imaginary means the symbolic takes hold in even the deepest recesses of the human organism. The teaching of this seminar is designed to maintain that imaginary effects, far from representing the core of analytic experience, the ideas we have, the concepts we have, the signified, and so on, give us nothing of any consistency unless they are related to the symbolic order that binds and orients them. So the imaginary is what in the psychoanalytic clinic obscures the symbolic relationship that is nonetheless determining us. We're determined by signifiers, by a signifier perhaps, but by signifiers, by the symbolic, and the imaginary ideas, meanings, concepts, empty speech, signifieds, and so on. This is what distorts or obscures our ability to see what's determining us. That's the point. The imaginary, the signifiers, and so on, obscure. So we've outlined two orders, the symbolic and the imaginary. The symbolic, the domain of the signifier, of signifier 1, and the imaginary of the signified. It's a really simplistic way to think about it. And that brings us to the point where I want to start twisting things. I want to start twisting things because next class we're moving toward psychoanalysis now. Right? It's psychoanalysis now next class. And when we talk about psychoanalysis now, I don't think simply talking about being determined by the symbolic is going to help us, by meanings, by signifiers. Psychoanalysis now is about something else. We talked about the symbolic and the imaginary, but we didn't talk about a dimension known as the real. There's something real which repeats, and this repetition is the place, where we endlessly return. We return endlessly to the same thoughts. For early Lacan and for Freud, this real, if we can call it that we're endlessly returning to, is at the level of the signifier. That's the problem with psychoanalysis then. The real is that which always returns to its place. It's always repeating. Lacan put it like this, I'm quoting. For the real, whatever upheaval we subject it to is always and in every case in its place. It carries its place stuck to the sole of its shoe. So we know that the real repeats. We also know that it always returns, which means we can't avoid the real. We can't avoid it. Yeah, it's like toilet paper, I guess. That's what the analogy is. I think it's supposed to be like toilet paper. By the way, the only time that you have toilet paper stuck to your heel or to the sole of your shoe or whatever is when you're walking and you don't know it's there. Nobody puts unless you're doing a joke, and that's perverse, but nobody sticks toilet paper to the heel of their shoe intentionally and is like, yeah, I'm just going to walk around like this. No, when it's there, it's because you don't know it's there. You don't want it to be there. It's embarrassing when it's there. It's anxiety provoking when it's there. That's the real. The real is not a product of the manifest content in this conception. So So I want to bring some pieces together to bring things to something of a conclusion. I hope it doesn't take me too long to develop it. I'll try and bring it together quickly. I'm not sure what I'll say yet. But Freud said that dreams of the same night, you can have multiple dreams in the same night. They're the same dream. That's what he said. That's what he wrote, sorry. So it means that the manifest content, the imaginary of our dreams, can be quite diverse. We can have different images of what our dreams were about, different concepts or ideas about about different dreams we've had. And yet beneath it all, when you interpret it, according to Freud, you get the same underlying latent content. So the symbolic is also a type of repetition. The meaning is being repeated, but it's a meaning that we can't face. So it's a meaning that's real. So we have a problem, right? The symbolic and the real both seem to return and repeat. What's repeated in psychoanalysis then was a meaning whose satisfaction we couldn't deliver in waking life. So it was our task to in the work of analysis and the work of interpretation, to understand those real satisfactions by looking at the dream work, by delivering it into a symbolic meaning, by giving it expression through speech, through signifiers, through saying something, right? So all of this development today, which was a lot, and I'm exhausted by it. It's wearing me out. I don't know why I did this, why I didn't just tell jokes for all this time, which is my typical thing. It's probably because I felt shackled to language. I feel alienated as a subject within this prison house of language that I have to teach on the seminar on the purloined letter, which I totally regret choosing. I'm even a bit embarrassed. It provokes a little anxiety in me. But I'm carrying it around and it's determining me. It's stuck to me. It's stuck to the heel of my syllabus, our syllabus. And so it determines my itinerary for what I can say to you even. So I had to develop it, though it's a little boring. I needed to prove that this conception of the unconscious and its relation to the dream meant that the objective of the clinic was to decipher meanings and to reveal the latent content, and that this was what interpretation seemed to mean for quite a long time. And yet we saw in a footnote from Freud that it wasn't necessarily the full position. Even Freud said there's something else. He seemed to have an intuition. He was already in some sense ahead of Lacan. So if you take anything from today's lecture at all, I'm not quite done yet, but if you do take anything from today's lecture, it should be this. The real and the symbolic form an alliance in the early days of dream interpretation. And the imaginary was an obstacle to the revelation of this truth, this meaningful truth. So interpretation aimed at truth, at the latent content, the truth of the latent content of what wasn't being said, but should be said. Like, oh, I secretly desire, I'm scared to say it in public because there's civilization norms and morals and rules against this sort of thing, but I secretly have these sexual practices, or I secretly really want this in my life or whatever. The idea was to speak that truth, but it could be said. There was an alliance between the symbolic and the real. That alliance between the symbolic and the real has a name. It's called death drive. It's a comfort. Death drive is a comfort. It's the comfort of meaning. So let's finalize all of this. Finally, it's within this seminar from Lacan that Lacan gives his first major schema, and it's called Schema L. Schema L. It's basically what I've posted here in my little diagram earlier. It could have been called Schema Z because it has the shape of a Z, but he wanted to call it Schema L because he's Lacan. Maybe he thought it was something singular about himself. But basically the rudimentary elements of this schema. Do I still have the drawing up? Let's see. Oh, good. The rudimentary elements of the schema are that the subject is here. You are up here at the top left as a unique individual. That's the place of the subject. And the subject is real for early Lacan. It's real only in the sense that there's a relation to the signifier that repeats, that you won't recognize as being what determines you. That's the alliance between the symbolic and the real. So the subject is determined by these signifiers, which is why this arrow should actually, and now you're going to see the full, basically the full schema L. This is actually what it looks like in the textbook. The arrow goes in this direction, which means the subject is determined by the signifier. And that's the full schema. It just took us a long time to get to it. So it's for this reason that in 1955, which is the same year that I think it's the same year that the seminar on the purloined letter was published, Lacan said in one of his other seminars, he's speaking, that the subject is related very essentially to the signifier. There's no subject without signifier for Lacan, and it's implied in Freud as well. So the psychotic as a unique class, the psychotic, the schizophrenic, and so on, as a unique class of human beings are those who, according to Lacan, I'm quoting him, chat, here it is, are totally ignorant of the language, the language that the psychotic, sorry, I mistyped it. The psychotic speech is totally ignorant of the language, something like that. It's, sorry, I translated from French, so I see now that my translation's a little messed up, but the idea is that the psychotic doesn't, oh God, thank you. The psychotic is ignorant of the language he or she speaks. The quote is messed up because I did almost a direct translation from French. It's because the psychotic doesn't realize that he or she is a subject of language, and so sees language as something outside of him or herself. So for the psychotic, there is no prison house of language. There's only the torture world of language. It's a world of freedom, a world within which the subject feels words much more harshly than others. The psychotic is terrorized by words. Every word is a trigger. Every word is a potential trigger for the psychotic. That line coming from the bottom right to the top left is different because the clinic presumes that the unconscious, which is in this early conception of psychoanalysis then, the unconscious is made up of signifiers. These signifiers determine the subject, determine the trajectory of the subject, and that means what a subject dreams, what a subject, how a subject relates to others, and so on. It's for this reason that the signifier is the stuff of the symbolic, and the unconscious structured like a language. The unconscious is, in this conception, always a symbolic unconscious. That's very important. The unconscious in this conception of psychoanalysis then is always a psychotic unconscious. Or not a psychotic unconscious, sorry, I'm tired. It's always a symbolic unconscious. God, okay, let's stop sharing. So I want to conclude with this point then, because I'm thinking ahead again at what I want to say. What is the position of truth here? What is truth in this conception? I mentioned the word truth a few times, but I don't think I fully explained it. Lacan said, and I'm quoting him, "It's with the appearance of language that the dimension of truth emerges." So a symbolic unconscious has some relation to truth. When we go to the clinic, when we dream, we express something of our truth. The truth as our unconscious wishes as expressed through language. But it doesn't mean that the unconscious is truth. The unconscious is, this is why simile is so important. The unconscious is not reducible to language. Truth is not the last word on the unconscious. Okay, I'm finally trying to piece it all together. It's hard for me because I have some notes, but I'm really just kind of trying to think in real time. Um, so Freud claimed that interpretation aims, in that footnote, he claimed that interpretation aims at the dream work as singular. Well, if truth concerns the unconscious structured like a language, and the unconscious has latent and manifest content, then what of the unconscious as a singular dream work? What happens when truth is not there? When interpretation does not aim at deciphering signifiers that determine us? What happens when signifiers do not determine us? What happens when we are all mad, psychotic in a sense? I want to conclude with this question because it's very, very important. It's important because it forces us to traverse the unconscious then to see how the unconscious now, as we understand it now, was already latent in what Freud had to say. There's something singular about Freud's text, something that we're only realizing now. This is why I want to have as our reference point next week what Freud called the navel of the dream. Sorry, I'm writing it, navel of the dream. Freud called it the navel of the dream. This is what I want to point at. The navel of the dream, he claimed, Freud, in his interpretation of dreams, it was the part of the dream that eludes interpretation. You can't say anything about the navel of the dream. It cannot be brought into the world of meaning. It can't be deciphered. It's why it's even something of a nightmare. It has nothing to do with condensation or displacement or representation or secondary revision and so on. The navel of the dream is what is most real of the dream. It's real, absolutely real. The symbolic does not have a grip on it. So when I speak of psychoanalysis now, which is our topic for next week, I'm using the word now in all of its urgency. Like when a child says, I need it now. I need it right now. There's an urgency. It happens suddenly. This now hits you like a total nightmare. It shakes you to your very core. This is the navel of the dream. It's what's without meaning. It shakes us. When we speak about psychoanalysis now, we're by necessity speaking of a time of nightmares, of panic, of certainty. It's a time when we're all woke, and the stuff, the engine of being awake, is the nightmare. That's what makes the dream possible. So that's basically what I wanted to say, but I guess I'll add one more thing and then I'll stop. It's that when we're talking about psychoanalysis, then I think it's correct to say that a concept of death drive was important. Why? Because what kills us in psychoanalysis then is the signifier. Like what kills us is signifier one. Signifier one says to the subject, you are determined by me. We're mortified by the signifier. That's death drive. And that's why there was always an alliance between symbolic and real. What happens in psychoanalysis now, I would say, and this isn't true of every tradition, but in my particular, admittedly very narrow domain, which is the Lacanian orientation, and even a more narrow domain within the Lacanian orientation, I would call it a singular domain within the Lacanian orientation, is we say, well, what did Lacan take from death drive? He took jouissance because death drive wasn't real enough. I'll just give you a simple, very quick demonstration of why death drive is not real enough. In a fraternity, and then I'll shut up. In a fraternity that I was once involved in, there was this guy I knew, and he used to brag all the time about how like death is all, you know, he's made his peace with death. Oh, he's so courageous. He can confront death. He's confronted death, and death is, we all need to confront. It's so easy to say that, you know, because death is a product in this conception of the imaginary. It's easy to imagine death. Death, by definition, cannot be made sense of, though. So stop, like you're still rendering it through signifiers here, right? So jouissance says something different. It says there's something that has no sense, whose meaning we can never find. That's where we're at now, I think, and that's what we need to contend with now. Dreams that cannot be interpreted, languages that cannot be understood, enjoyments that we'll never understand, but people do it. Monstrosities that parade in public. Instead of, I'm going to talk about this in my other class, but the whole idea of monsters I find interesting because back, when I was a kid, to be a monster was a terrible thing. You would try and hide it. People would try and beat you up, You're a monster, you have your own particular types of unique enjoyment and so on. Nobody can really make sense of it. We had every Friday, they had an event called Beat the Freak Night at my high school where they would beat you up if you were monstrous. Now today, you know what they say? They say, let your freak flag fly, which means embrace the monster you are. To be a monster publicly is what we're all kind of expected to do. This is the new world we're living in. It's the world of jouissance. Okay, I'm gonna stop here because I think we only have couple minutes left. I apologize for talking so much. I promise, I've even made a note. Next time, no deep, crazy lectures, and shorter and much more casual and more punchlines. I wrote that. It's written right here in my book. So, anybody have any thoughts? Any questions? We have a couple minutes. I think we're here till 2, right? Yes. Okay. Yes. So let's chat for at least a few more minutes. I'm told that you're legally allowed to go 5 minutes early. I tried to see if you can go 10 minutes early, but I couldn't get a conclusive answer. Yeah, go ahead.
So I might have misinterpreted Lacan's concepts, and probably my question might be a little off topic, but still. So you mentioned sign as a trace. So my question is, are dreams are their footprints or traces of signs? So it's a little bit hard. I hope you understood it.
Dwayne, you are muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
Thank you. It's probably a good thing when I'm muted. They talk about the silence of the analyst, and yet you're meeting the verbosity of the analyst. Anyway, I do understand the question, and that's even the problem, that I understand it, because it does open up some difficult stuff. So Lacan's answer was that the dream, Lacan's early answer was that the dream is composed of signifiers. Ultimately, when we settle on a meaning, on a particular meaning for the dream, that's where the obscuration is happening. And so the idea is to get beyond that. So, I think the easiest way to sort of understand this is to go back to this conception I was talking about of the 3 types of the signs, or the 3 levels of the signs for early Lacan, where the sign is attached to its object. Is that a dream? Does that happen in a dream, where a sign is attached to its object? I'm not sure. Ultimately, humans dream through signifiers, and that means that something's missing. The psychoanalytic word for this process of missing something is castration, and it's because we can't deal with what's missing that we dream. So we dream through signifiers, which is not exactly like traces. The trace, that it was a foot that was there, right? So you have a foot, it steps in the sand, the foot is not there anymore, it's gone. But with the trace, you can say, oh, it's gone, but I know it was a foot. Now, let's say you're in your apartment, as many of us are right now, and you have something, an ID, let's say you have your IDs, all of your IDs, your identification documents, your passport, and so on, across the desk. Yeah. You know what these IDs are. They're you. Or so you think. And so you see them. Now, what if those objects go missing? You could say, on the one hand, that it's a trace. You knew the IDs, but even the IDs were a trace to begin with. They were not who you actually are. So this is the level of the human animal. The human animal for early Lacan, and I would say for Freud, although he doesn't use the word signifier and so on, there's this movement of language that kind of maybe never settles. It never settles because it always hits what Freud called the hard rock of castration. It always hits the point at which something is fundamentally missing. And that's how language functions. I'm going to give you a few more examples, Maria, maybe more concrete, because, like, let's be honest, like, most people are not going to understand this. So if you can even get a little piece of it, that's okay. Or even an intuition of it, that's what's important. This is really high level stuff, I admit. But, you know, how does a dictionary work? I know this is a stupid example, but it's probably one that many of you can identify with. How does a dictionary work? Well, it's a system of language. Let's say I want to know what a llama is. Let's say I want to know what a llama is. Well, I consult the dictionary. The llama is the signifier. I need to know the signifier. Taken together, we'd have the sign for Saussure. So the llama is signifier. The signified would be the definition. Well, what is it? I don't know. I'm going to check it out. Llama definition is a domesticated pack animal of the camel family found in the wherever, who cares? Soft woolly fleece. I have the definition. Now, a typical person would stop there and say, this is what I dreamt about, a soft woolly animal who's domesticated. That's the manifest content. I've got myself some meaning and I got myself some comfort, which is what the dream ultimately wants to give you. So you feel like, okay, but what if you're a psychoanalyst or somebody maybe like Saussure or Jacques Derrida or some of these philosophers? You'd say, well, what if I don't know what wool is? What if I don't know what the word domesticated is? What if I don't know what the word animal is? What if I don't know any of those words in the definition? That signified has now become a signifier, and now it's pointing at something else. And this is how the dictionary works, right? Like you can keep pointing at another word. Okay, what is a pen? It's a thing for writing that has ink in it. What is ink? Ink is this. What is that? And you can just keep going. This is what Jacques Derrida, in fact, called difference, which is this idea that the signified is an illusion. It's a fraud. This was even the central insight of a school of philosophy known as post-structuralism. Oh my God, are we beyond our time? No, we go to 2, right? Yeah, you said 2. So yeah, and so the idea was to expose the fraud of the signified and the sign to show that it keeps moving. Signifiers are always pointing at other signifieds. What Freud and Lacan and psychoanalysis add, and this is why we're absolutely and importantly and fundamentally and singularly different from philosophers, continental philosophers in the tradition of Derrida and so on, because you do have Lacanian philosophers. What they added is that at some point you hit the hard rock of castration, something that cannot be said, something that cannot be defined. That's the real. And Freud claimed that analysis ends at the hard rock of castration, and we don't know what to do at that point, when all meanings fail and so on. Lacan went further. He went beyond the hard rock of castration. He went from psychoanalysis then to psychoanalysis now, and he said, beyond death drive, there's jouissance, which is something fundamentally enigmatic, and something that has no alliance with the symbolic, something that brings us no comfort necessarily, though we enjoy it. And so it's not about the symbolic anymore at that point. So yeah, your question was, can you think of dreams as places where you have traces? And the answer is intuitively, I understand why you'd say that, because it does seem like that. That's why it's a really good question. You could say, like, for example, I have an umbrella with a bird on it. Okay, that's condensation. So what is actually missing there is some other meaning that's not apparent, and we need to focus on it. That other meaning is perhaps that I can't think on the top of my head. I want to be a bird so I can fly high above the bad weather and be free. So it's a desire for freedom or something like that. Okay, well, maybe it's a trace of that. The psychoanalyst would say, no, we need to go further. We need to go to what's singular about the dream, which is basically you are castrated in a sense, whether you're a man or a woman. There's something that shakes us to our core. And this is the bridge that brings us from then to now. But the great paradox and irony is that psychoanalysis then is a pretension, or sorry, psychoanalysis now is pretentious. It's absolutely arrogant to say psychoanalysis now. That's why I said it. I think I'm the one who developed the title, or maybe we developed it together, Julie and I, but I'll blame myself for having an arrogant title. What's most now about psychoanalysis was already there, but hidden in the work of Freud, and we didn't see it, which is the singular dream work, the singularity, what is most real. It didn't fully answer your question. It partially answered your question, and it added a whole bunch more.
No, I get it, by the way, so thank you.
You know, you're hearing me talk endlessly, and that's kind of interesting because, you know, back when, no, I can tell. There's no way I'm going to be able to finish this thought in 3 minutes. Let's, unless anybody else has any other questions, let's put an end to the madness. All right, folks. I'll see you in the seminar.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.